Welcome to another episode of One-on-One with Mitch Lafon. Joining me this week is Steven Wilson of Porcupine Tree, the great Steven Wilson. And to discuss this is Talking Metal's Mark Strigl. Good day, Mark. How are you?
I'm good. How you doing, Mitch?
Very well, actually. It's been a while since you've had a chance to host. You've been doing that metal show for a while. It kept you busy, but it's nice to have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be back. I miss doing this with you, and it's such a good show. It doesn't mean I haven't been listening. I was just listening to the Tom Kiefer interview you did recently. Great stuff, and kind of bummed, that he's saying right now it looks like there's no real future for Cinderella.
Yeah, it's funny. When I asked him, does he prefer being a solo artist or in a band? He goes, "Well, I am in a band now." And it's like, uh-oh, that doesn't
Right.
sound good. What happened to the band, right? But and of course, we've had Bill Leverty sitting in doing your spot. I hope you've been enjoying Bill and his
Yeah, definitely.
contributions.
Absolutely.
Gotta love Bill, and of course, his new single is strong. So, head over to leverty.com to check that out. What else should we mention? Ah, yes, the Heavy Montreal Festival taking place August 7th, 8th, and 9th at Parc Jean Drapeau this year. Korn, Slipknot, Lamb of God, Dokken. Who else? You.
Pentagram, Lita Ford,
That's right. Warrant.
Warrant. I'm looking forward to seeing Fozzy with
Yeah, that'll
Rich
be good.
Ward and Chris
Yeah, good friend of
Jericho.
yours, actually.
Yeah, Rich is definitely a friend. Great guy. And speaking of that metal show which you mentioned earlier, I got to actually host and produce these things they do online called That Metal Gear. And Rich Ward from Fozzy joined me, and we went through his entire rig, and we just been kind of internet friends ever since. So I can't wait to see them at Heavy Montreal. Very underrated band, by the way. And I
Yes.
think in a weird way, Chris Jericho's stardom as a wrestler and on Dancing with the Stars and everything else that he does, in some ways, at least for me, I never really paid much attention to Fozzy because I was like, oh, that's just that guy's side project
Right.
thing. But he's the real deal. He can really sing, and he's a real student of heavy metal and hard rock. And their last record was so good. And if you haven't heard it, it's on Spotify. It's on iTunes, and I believe it's called How to Start a War.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
Yeah, and of course, I think we mentioned also you're going to be there, which is going to be exciting. So you and I and our Metal Raps triple co-host there, Mitch Joel, will be there. It'll be the dream team at Heavy Montreal.
Yeah, I do have my tickets. My airline tickets are booked, and my hotel is booked, and I will be there all 3 days. I might have to leave a little early Sunday evening, afternoon, but I just cannot wait. It's going to be a great time. And yeah, Mitch and I and you will do a hopefully like a in-person metal raps for the first time.
Yeah, that'll be cool. Now, of course, in down in the Baltimore area, they have the M3 Festival, but with Mark, Mitch, and Mitch, it'll be the 3M Festival at HM.
There you go.
So there you go. Let's get into today's guest, Steven Wilson. Wow, what can you tell? What can you say about this guy? He plays pretty much any instrument. He produces, he mixes, he masters, he remixes, he sings. It's everything. New album is called Hand Cannot Erase, which we talk about during the interview. But for folks who listen to Talking Metal and to this show, who are more into the metal scene, he's done some stuff with Opeth.
Yeah, he has. He's done 3 of their records.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because after he did those, I feel like the Porcupine Tree sound changed slightly, and they started to have heavier moments. At least I'm more of a casual Porcupine Tree fan, but I do have one of their super early on CDs, which is probably, we're going back like 20 years at this point, 15 years at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the more recent stuff, the stuff that they started putting out in the 2000s, the sound definitely got a little heavier for Porcupine Tree. And I kind of wondered if that was the influence of Steve working with Opeth. Just a theory, but
yeah, it could be. And also the last couple of records, Fear of a Blank Planet and The Incident, were on Roadrunner Records. So maybe they had some of the folks at Roadrunner saying, hey, let's metal this up a bit. But then, of course, he went off with Mikael Åkerfeldt of Opeth and did this other band called Storm of Corrosion. So during the interview, we talk to Stephen about Storm of Corrosion. We talk about the Opeth stuff, and we also talk about him remixing classic albums, from Jethro Tull, from Gentle Giant, Yes, and many more. And we find out, is Porcupine Tree coming back, or is that project sort of done? Everybody seems to love a reunion, right? All my interviews. Yeah. You talk to Tom Kiefer, you talk about interviews or reunions. You talk with Rachel Bolan or Tony Harnell. A lot of bands and a lot of fans seem to want to just live in yesteryear, right?
Yeah, well, they definitely do. And then when they get these reunions and things don't sound like they used to, they get all worked up and upset about that. So yeah, can't win.
No, you can't win. I mean, look at Van Halen in 2004. They did the whole Sammy Hagar thing, and fans didn't show up.
Right.
So
very true.
What are you going to do? But let's get back to Steven Wilson. Why don't we just listen to Steven? And it's a great interview. Love Steven. He was so amenable and so pleasant, and he talked about anything and everything. Here is Steven Wilson. Good day, Steven. Pleasure to talk to you.
You too, sir. How are you?
Good. So much to talk about. You're one of those artists where I really don't know where to start.
Okay.
There's too
All right.
much.
Well, I can't help you there. You have to make the first shot across the bows, as it were.
There we go. So let's start off with the new album, Hand Cannot Erase.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about putting this album together. I know that it has some kind of theme connection to the Joyce Carol Vincent story, but is it a concept record per se?
I think it's safe to say it is conceptual. Yeah. I mean, I describe what I do these days as conceptual rock. I don't really like any other generic term, but I like conceptual rock because I think for me, what it tells you is that this is music that is trying to tell stories.
Right.
And sometimes those stories can be literally stories, and sometimes they can be more like the music is feeling like it's taking you on a journey, even though it's not literally telling you a story. But in this case, Hand Cannot Erase really literally is telling you a story about a young woman who grows up and comes to live in the city and essentially begins this process of disappearing, of erasing herself from the consciousnesses of the rest of the human race. And I find that, this is based on a true life story, as you mentioned, Joyce Carol Vincent. This is exactly what happened to her. My character is not Joyce Carol Vincent. She's based on the idea of Joyce Carol Vincent, or at least the idea of how she died. But she is an opportunity for me to talk about life in the city, life in the 21st century, specifically life in the age of the internet and social networking. And, I could talk all day about this, but that in a nutshell is what this concept album is about, yeah.
Are we slowly erasing ourselves with social media? I mean, we have this concept of cocooning where everybody sort of stays at home and talks to each other via Twitter. Is that what we're slowly doing, you think?
I think so. Yeah, I think there are things like social networking, which of course are anything but social. They are very antisocial, and there are kids growing up now that are learning to communicate through Twitter, through Facebook, even through computer gaming. That's how they communicate, through text messaging. And yet I come back to this thing that 80% of communication is body language.
Right.
And these kids are not developing the art of body language, and I think even adults are losing some of that too, So I do worry about that. I do worry about the whole notion of friends on Facebook, friends that you have never met and you never will meet, people who create a kind of fantasy version of themselves, which they project through the internet to other people, which bears no reality to their true personality. And you take that to the extreme and you have grown men pretending to be 12-year-old boys in order to lure other 12-year-old boys, pedophiles and things like that. So there are all sorts of other sinister implications too.
Right.
But I think ultimately, without going to the sinister implications, I think the whole world is becoming more disconnected, more alienated, less communicative, and that really worries me. And I suppose I'm not the only one that worries about that. But this is kind of my way of dealing with that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When you make an album like Hand Cannot Erase, or let me rephrase this. You love to make albums. It's an art form for you. Have we lost that? I mean, in this day and age of iTunes and Spotify, where you can go pick one song, is the album a lost art form? Is it going the way of the 8-track tape?
Well, I think yes and no. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think every time there is a big swing in a particular direction, there is always a swing back in the other direction. What we're seeing right now is, yes, we do live in the world very much of streaming. We live in the world where there's that kind of jukebox mentality where you put together your playlist or you just follow the links from one song to the other. At the same time, there are a lot of people that have kind of rebelled against that and are getting back into the art of album listening, because I have to tell you that a lot of people say things like that to me, and they think they're unique in feeling differently. And I have to tell you, there's a lot of people out there that I speak to, and a lot of those people are young kids, and they are completely embracing the idea of the album as a continuum, as an art form, as a storytelling device, and embracing the idea of an album as analogous with going to see a movie at the cinema or reading a book, And so I'm not naive enough to believe that the album will ever be as culturally significant or important as it was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, or even the 90s. I don't think that's ever going to come back to that extent. But I do see there is a healthy swing back in the other direction, that there are kids buying vinyl particularly, right. Kids getting into the idea of albums as, complete continuums and art forms. So I'm, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I'd have been a bit more negative. I'm cautiously optimistic. And the fact that this album has been by far the most successful of my career, whilst at the same time being probably one of the most concept-driven things I've ever done, if not the most concept-driven thing I've ever done, makes me think actually things aren't that bad. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, so I'm getting onto concept records for a minute here. I want to go back to some of the other work you do with remixing. Most recently, Gentle Giants, The Power and the Glory. You've done the Yes albums. What has got you interested in doing remixes? And what is the challenge for you as an artist or professionally in doing that kind of work?
Well, I think what got me interested in remixing was really the fact that I had become so fascinated in the whole process of making records that had a degree of sonic excellence to them. Right. And this is going back into my own work to begin with, and I began to get a little bit of a reputation for being someone that actually made quite good sounding records.
Absolutely.
And so I started to get other people asking me to mix their records. The idea to start remixing classic albums really came up because of 5.1. Right. And of course, a lot of those classic albums from the 70s and the 80s albums I've done were never mixed into 5.1 surround sound the first time around. So there was an interest in the first major project I ever did was the King Crimson catalogue. And that had never been mixed into 5.1. So the real factor there was we want to create a surround sound version of these albums. And that's led on, because that was such a successfully received series, that's led on to me doing, the Tull, the Yes, the Gentle Giant, the Roxy Music, Tears for Fears. And it's been fantastic because these are all albums I genuinely love. And by the way, I have turned down some albums because I didn't feel I was the right person to do them, because I just genuinely couldn't say I loved them.
Right.
So, but all these records I've been doing, I genuinely love. I believe I know them better than the artists. That sounds like a facetious thing to say, but it's actually true, because most musicians don't listen to their records again once they've finished them. But I've been listening to these records for years, and so I think I'm the right person to be, deconstructing and reconstructing them. And the other answer to part of your question, I suppose, is that I learn a lot from doing it.
Okay.
And I learn a lot about techniques going back to the late 60s through the 70s and 80s that are not things that are common knowledge, I guess, in the age of computer recording. So in being able to deconstruct and reconstruct these records, I'm picking up tips and techniques that I probably would never have learned otherwise. And being able to obviously talk to the musicians themselves is a great help in that too.
And then you can take that into your, record making.
Exactly.
Mikael Åkerfeldt of Opeth, and you got together and did a band or a project called STORM CORROSION. Tell me a little bit about working with Mikael. You had a chance to produce their Blackwater Park album. What is it that's so special about Opeth that you wanted to work with them and actually produce, and not just be a musician or somebody in the room?
Well, I think initially what fascinated me about Opeth is that they were coming from a completely different musical tradition to the one that I'd come from.
Right.
But had kind of arrived at a similar point, if that makes some sense.
Right.
So Michael's a few years younger than me. He grew up with death metal, extreme metal, black metal. But he had gradually become more and more fascinated by the whole spectrum of experimental rock music. And the great thing about Mikael is that he can talk to you equally about ABBA and Captain Beefheart than he can about, I don't know, Metallica or Bathory. And I love that about him. And I think, those kind of people are endlessly fascinating to hang out with and talk to. And inevitably, Mikael also being an extraordinarily gifted musician, that kind of begins to spill over into collaboration. And that collaboration, as you said, started out with me being involved with one of the Opeth records. But gradually Mikael has moved more and more away from metal and more towards a much more open, a very contemporary form of progressive or conceptual rock music himself.
Absolutely.
And the great thing about Mikael is there is nothing that you can say to him that he will consider to be too bizarre an idea. And I love that. And vice versa. There's nothing he can say to me that I will say, that's a ridiculous idea. What are you thinking? And so there's almost, when we work together, there's almost that sense of us both egging each other on to come up with more and more bizarre or crazy kind of ideas for sonics and music. And that definitely came to fruition in the STORM CORROSION record, which I think was, in many ways, was a record that nobody expected us to make that kind of record. It's almost kind of pseudo-surreal chamber music, in some senses, or dark folk music. I think everyone was expecting some kind of progressive metal, supergroup thing. And I love that. I love that about working with him, that there was no interest in doing what was expected, and that obviously that's something that resonates very strongly with me too.
Is there more work with Mikael in the future, or was that the one?
Yeah.
Okay. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, nothing. We don't have any plans right now, but I mean, I would be very surprised if we wouldn't get together and do something again. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have to say, interviewing Mikael a few years ago was one of the funnest experiences. You've done other projects: No Man, Base Communion, Blackfield, of course, Porcupine Tree. Are you at heart a band person or a solo artist?
Definitely a solo artist. I mean, even when I've been in bands, I've never written, or very, very, very rarely been able to write in a kind of communal way. You know, even in Porcupine Tree, which was notionally a band, 95% of the music was written by me and presented to the band almost as a fait accompli, you know. So there's always been that sense for me. And, of course, the band started off as a solo project anyway. The first three albums were just... So I think, historically speaking, and I think partly the reason for this is when I was growing up, there was no one else I knew who really wanted to make the kind of music I wanted to make. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, and, you know, I was listening to music from I was listening to 80s music, but I was also listening to music going back to the 70s, the 60s, even the 50s. I was listening to, like, Karlheinz Stockhausen and experimental. I was a very precocious, probably very annoying and very pretentious teenager, you know. But the bottom line was I couldn't find anyone else that really wanted to, you know, to make this kind of weird music. So almost by default, I started to make music on my own. And I was very lucky that my father was an electronic engineer and built me, you know, like a little 4-track, multi-track machine and an echo machine and a sequencer. So my dad was building all this stuff that enabled me to become, you know, self-sufficient in that respect. And I guess once that was ingrained in me, I was never going to be a team player. I could never be you know, completely a team player. So I think that probably answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Back in, let me think, it was 2007 perhaps, you had a chance to work with Yoko Ono to redo the song Death of Samantha.
Right.
What was it like working with Yoko Ono? I mean, she's just sort of a polarizing character. Beatle fans, you know, oh, she broke up the Beatles, and yet other fans are like, she's an artist, she's well. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I'm definitely in the latter camp. I think she's an extraordinary artist. I mean, you're asking me, what was it like working with one of the most famous human beings on the planet Earth? I mean, yes. She is. Everyone knows who Yoko Ono is, you know, whether for better or worse, you know. I mean, I have to tell you, I didn't meet her. This was all done by, you know, through managers and stuff. But I was happy to be able to work on her because I think she is tremendously underrated as an artist, and she's almost in a sense sacrificed her own credibility, you know, in a sense, because of the whole Beatles situation. And people forget that she was a very successful, very experimental, very innovative and progressive avant-garde artist long before she met John Lennon, and which is of course why he was interested in her in the first place. Listen, I don't think she's got the greatest singing voice. I don't think she does either. But there is something very unique about everything she touches and everything she does. And of course that is going to appeal to me because that's really what interests me about any art, is there's something unique about it. There's something, there's a strong personality that goes through it. And certainly the one thing you can say about Yoko is there is a very strong personality through everything she does.
Oh, I fully agree. Let me get back to Porcupine Tree for a minute. Is that something that will continue in the future, or is it really we're doing Steven Wilson solo projects and, you know, we'll do something with Michael, or is there a future for Porcupine Tree at this point?
It's really difficult for me to answer because I don't really see a great distinction anyway between.
Right. Well, that's the thing.
Yeah, I've basically continued under my own name doing what I probably would have, probably the same direction I would have pushed Porcupine Tree in anyway, you know. The advantage for me in being a solo artist is being able to, I guess, have these rather grander sort of conceptions for the live shows and the multimedia stuff that probably would have been outvoted by a democratic band, you know, on the basis of the cost, you know. And also being able to, I guess, work with a sort of broader palette of music and musicians, which of course appeals to me massively. I never wanted to be a musician. I wanted to be a director, an auteur, you know. And one of the unfortunate things about Porcupine Tree was I kind of had been cast in this role as lead guitar player, and I didn't really want to be a lead guitar player. I wanted to be, kind of almost like the conductor or the director. And I think now being a solo artist, I've kind of recast myself in the role that I really wanted in the first place, So I don't know if I answered your question or not. I'm not ruling out Porcupine Tree making another record one day, but the reality is that I think it would be a side project now to what is clearly the main focus of my career, which is the work I release under my own name. Yeah.
And I know we only have 20 minutes, and we're getting there. So let me finish with these two things: the live show. As you said, it really is, a multimedia experience. How important is the live show to you, and how much of it does it have to be a visual presentation above the music or with the music?
I don't really think of it as it has to be.
Okay.
I just want it to be. I guess because I've always had in my mind very strong images when I write these songs. It's almost as soon as I've written a song, I already have a kind of image in my mind, or almost a piece of cinema kind of playing in my mind if this is how it will look. And the association for me between cinema and music has always been very strong since I was a kid. I mean, I was just as excited by cinema when I was a kid as I was by music, So I've always been fascinated by the two, and I think the two together is a very, very potent, force. Music and picture together, if they're in sympathy together, I think they are greater even than the sum of their parts. Much as I love music on its own, I think music with image can be even more powerful and even more moving. So one of the things I've always wanted to do, and I was finally able to do when I became a solo artist, is to pretty much invest all of the money that I was making from the music and channel it back into creating something spectacular from a live performance multimedia-based perspective. And I want people to come to the show and go away saying, "Wow, that's one of the best shows I've ever seen." Because I think that in this kind of modern age, there are so many bands out there playing live all the time. There's any day of the week in London, there's probably 50 or 60 bands playing. How do you make your potential audience buy your ticket instead of some of the other tickets? And I think you have to really kind of raise the bar with live shows these days, and that's what I've been really committed to. And artistically, it's incredibly satisfying to me as well. I love being at the center of this incredible extravaganza with amazing musicians and quadraphonic sound and films and visuals. It's an incredible buzz for me.
I agree. I mean, a show should be spectacle and not just let me see some guy stare at his shoes for an hour.
Right. I think these days, it really has to be, because there are so many people out there on the circuit. You've got to excel to really stand out from the crowd.
No, I fully agree, and we're out of time, but I'll just finish with. You've got Nick Beggs on bass. I used to communicate often with Nick from Kajagoogoo. Just for the fun of it, what's it like being with Nick? I mean, he's a great guy, right?
Nick is a sweetheart, yeah. I mean, all my band are absolutely lovely people, and they're fun to be with. And Nick is no ego, very humble guy, extraordinary musician. What's not to love? I love the guy, yeah.
Absolutely. Stephen, absolute pleasure. I could have asked another 120 questions, but our time's up. Thank you.
Okay, Mitch, nice to speak to you, buddy. Have a great day.
Bye now. There you have it, folks. My interview with Stephen Wilson of Porcupine Tree, No Man, IEM, Bass Communion, Blackfield, Storm Corrosion, recorded a song with Yoko Ono. Wow, that's all you can say. Yeah. And of course, this episode is brought to you by the Heavy Montreal Festival, taking place August 7th, 8th, and 9th at Parc Jean Drapeau in beautiful downtown Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Korn, Faith No More, and Slipknot are your headliners. And of course, this podcast is brought to you by Talking Metal Digital, which, Mark, is all yours. It's your baby.
Yeah, well, and everyone else who's involved, like you, we have your show as part of the family. Victor from Mars Attacks, Metal Raps, and Talking Metal, of course, and maybe 3 times a year I'll slip out a talking rock podcast, and I don't know. Now I have this idea. I want to do a guitar based podcast where all we talk about is guitar gear and the almost influenced by what Mitch
Yeah,
Joel
that's
is
what I was
doing with
gonna
his
say.
bass player podcast.
The
I'm
the
kind of
whole
ripping him off, thinking I should do something, but just about guitar playing. But who knows? Really, seriously, not enough time in the day. But it's something I'd love to do at some
then in
point.
that case, I might have to do one on just lead singers or something, or just
Yeah, there you go. There you
just
go.
drummers, right?
Drummers, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So what do you think of Steven Wilson? That guy is just busy. I mean, just
Yeah.
unbelievably busy and talented.
Yeah, and diverse too, I think is another word that describes him, from working with, Opeth to Yoko Ono.
I
And,
mean, yeah, honestly.
I know he had on the Porcupine Tree album a couple years back, they had a lot of guest stars like Alex Lifeson played some guitar on it, and Robert Fripp, I believe. So yeah, just a diverse guy who has really just given us so much great music through the years.
Yeah, and fans just really, really love him. On the next episode of One on One, I'm going to bring in drummer Ken Mary. Are you familiar with Ken?
I don't think so.
Ken was the drummer for the Alice Cooper band in the mid 80s when Alice disappeared, and then he came back in around 85 or 86. Ken was part of the band. And then after that, after leaving Alice, he was the original drummer for House of Lords and did a couple of albums with them. So,
Cool.
yeah, great stories from Ken Mary. That'll be on the next episode. Anything else to add?
No, I don't think so. TalkingMetal.com is the site where you
Yep.
can get all the podcasts. And yeah, I can't wait for Heavy Montreal. I will be there. It's going to be great.
Yeah, it's going to be great. And of course, subscribe to the Talking Metal podcast and One on One with Mitch Lafon on iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, TuneIn. Did I forget any? No.
No, Spreaker.
Spreaker. That's
Yeah.
the one.
Yeah.
There you go, folks. Thank you, folks.